You there? Hello, everyone.
Hello,
How are we today?
excellente.
Good. See some familiar faces, some new ones, so that's great. I have been pretty excited about this. Looking forward to presenting this one um, all week today. But, or I should say, I've been excited about presenting it all week. And um, I think I want to start off first of all by saying that in preparation for this, really I've decided that this is actually needs to be more of a series of probably 3 or maybe even more in this, simply because as I was preparing for it, I realized that I could probably talk for days about it. So look forward to that. I think if really, okay, so if you're able to catch 1/3 of kind of what we're discussing here today, it's going to save you about 20 years of head scratching, because it's a passion of mine, and it's something that I've been just working on for such a long time, and it's something that I very much enjoy sharing. So welcome to this. Now, first of all, before we get going, are there any questions from last time that need to be kind of addressed or whatever at this point, or should I launch into it?
As far as I'm concerned, you can go ahead and launch.
All right.
I'm a little lost and have a lot to learn, but I have appreciated your session so far. Thank you.
Yeah, sure, definitely. And like I've said before, this one is going to be fairly fast paced, so feel free to jump in at points in time. If something doesn't make sense to you or whatever, please do. Okay.
Here,
All
so
right.
I have a question.
Yes, hi.
If we missed the last one, are we at a disadvantage, or will this be a little bit more difficult?
No, you're not at a disadvantage at all. Most of these are fairly well self-supporting, although this being the first in a series probably would be pretty important to catch this one.
Okay.
Having said that though, we are recording these and I'll be making them available. So just, to check the group, and you'll see that recording pop up possibly sometime today, but more likely early next week.
Okay.
Okay. So, and you can also catch the prior meetings that way as well.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, sure. All right, so before I begin, I want to kind of introduce a concept that I've talked about a few times, known as the ray of creation. And it's a way to think about the universe from the concept or with respect to scale. And what I mean is that within the universe, there's this kind of aspect of dominion or laws, because today's thing's about the laws. And I want to start off by giving an example, and we're going to start at something very local to us, which would be our moon. And if you think about it for a moment, the moon is kind of under dominion of the planet, from the standpoint that it orbits the planet, right? And it doesn't have that kind of free choice to be able to just launch off and and go somewhere else, right? Now the planet is in or under the dominion of, I should say, of all of the other planets in the solar system as a body. And this is kind of a difficult concept to begin to understand from the standpoint that each time you move up a scale, you have to think about it in the terms of a body or an organized unit, which is what a body is, right? So if you think about the planet just being a member, or like maybe the right arm or the right pinky or something like that of the larger body of all of the planets in the solar system, then you realize that kind of just like your right hand can't go independently and leave your body, the planet can't leave that body of the solar system. Now we move up one layer and realize that the sun has dominion or control from a law perspective, natural law perspective, over all of the planets in the solar system. And by that fact, also has dominion or control kind of once removed over the moons, right? So you've got a moon orbiting the Earth moving as a body in the solar system, and the sun is kind of exerting that gravitational control over that. But the sun is also part of a larger body of all suns in the universe, okay? And, or I should actually say all suns in the Milky Way galaxy, our particular galaxy. And our sun is but one that is rotating around the center of the Milky Way galaxy, okay? And so the Milky Way is in control of our sun. And all galaxies taken together as a body are rotating some unknown center, which I tend to just call the absolute. Okay, so does that concept make sense? How it's like going from the lowest to the highest in the sense of scale. And like I said, the moon can't just decide to begin to orbit the center of the Milky Way or orbit the center of all galaxies. It's under dominion or under a certain amount of laws. Each level in the ray of creation introduces more and more restrictions, more and more laws. And this is going to become important a little bit later. So, understand that the moon is under the laws of the Earth and the laws of all planets and the laws of the sun and the laws of the galaxy, and ultimately under the laws of the universe, which become less and less and less, kind of the higher up you go in the scale in that. And the laws of the universe are only, the restrictions of the universe as a body is only under one law, the law of the absolute. Whatever it is, it orbits or rotates, okay? So the important concept to understand in this is that the higher you go in the ray of creation, that scale that I just gave, the fewer laws, and the lower you go in it, the more laws. So it should kind of give you, I guess, a bit of an indication of sort of where we are in the scheme of things, in the universal scheme of things. Because if you think about it, we're actually somewhat, aside from jumping in a rocket and leaving the planet, which is a permission that, if you want to get esoteric about it, no other creature really has, right? Dog doesn't do that unless we stick it on board. But we are also under the laws of the planet. So in one respect, we're actually similar to a moon, except we reside on that thin film of organic life that inhabits the surface of the planet. Another point that I want to get across in all of this is that the higher up in the ray of creation one goes, the more energetic things become. And the lower one goes in the ray of creation, the more physical things become, right? And you can think of, when I gave that example of moon, planet, all planets, sun, Milky Way, universe, you can find that the sun, our sun, sits right in the middle if you take it in that scale. And thinking about it from the standpoint of our sun is literally half energetic and half material, right? I mean, if you believe the idea of science that it's a fusion machine, then it's using energy to literally convert lighter substances like hydrogen into heavier ones, and so on and so forth. But as you move up from that, scientists know that the universe, that our galaxy, for instance, is mostly energy, right? Dotted with very, 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 very few bits of matter in it. And of course, one level even higher, the universe is 99.99999% energy and only 0.1% matter from that standpoint.
Did Einstein said that matter is energy too?
One more time, it didn't come through right.
Did Einstein said that matter is energy too? Just compressed.
Right. So yes, and that's true. And so one way to look at that is that if you take that E equals mc squared formula, you can say on the higher end of the ray of creation, you have the E. At the sun would be the equals, and at the lower end would be the M. In other words, mass. Yeah. So you've got this kind of bar in there with the balance point being the sun, not just our sun, but any sun. Okay. Yeah. Good point. All right. So is it clear what I mean by laws? it's not like man-made laws. It's what we're discussing today is what are known as the natural laws, okay? And it's these orders of progression. Fundamentally, and I'll demonstrate this throughout this lesson, fundamentally there are three laws. There is first and foremost the law of unity, which would be just known as the absolute. The second one would be what's known as the law of eternity. And this is an aspect of time. It's also been called the law of seven. We'll get into why that is. And then the third fundamental law is known as the law of three, or the law of infinity. And it is a kind of a fundamental aspect of the law of space. Because everything from an experiential point of view, everything that we deal with deals with basically four things, right? We deal with energy, we deal with matter, we deal with time, and we deal with space. And so those four principles really are the crucible in which we find ourselves, and the crucible in which a some sort of journey could take place, right? I'm going to share. So we're all together, yeah? Any questions so far? Good. Okay. I want to share a video with you because this is going to be important when we get into the concepts that I'm presenting here. So can you all see this screen here? Says the harmonic series. Give me a thumbs up if you can.
No.
No, it's not showing? Hold on. Aha, that's the problem. How about now?
Yes.
That's it.
Now, I've never shared a video that comes from the internet in a thing like this before, so I'm hoping this works. If it doesn't, then I will resort to the whiteboard behind me, give a demonstration. But we're going to try this real quick, okay?
When you play a note on a particular instrument, say middle C on the piano, the resulting sound is a complex wave. That piano string vibrates as a whole, but it also vibrates in halves, and in thirds, and in fourths, and so on. When it does this, it produces notes above the notes that were played, which we call harmonics.
The built-in, preordained universal known as the harmonic series.
Real quick, are you guys able to hear this?
Yes.
Okay.
In this series that we call the harmonic series or the overtone series, we call that bottom note the fundamental, or the first partial. That fundamental will have a particular frequency. For example, this A has a frequency of 55 hertz. This fundamental frequency is important because the harmonic series is an additive series, not an exponential one, which means that we find each additional partial by adding the fundamental frequency. So the second partial will be 55 from the fundamental frequency plus 55 to give us 110 hertz, which gives us the A an octave above, because the octave is a 2-to-1 ratio. From there, we can keep adding 55 hertz to the previous partial to get the rest of the notes in the series. In theory, this series goes on into infinity. I'm going to stop at 16. It's also important to know that each partial above the fundamental is significantly quieter than the fundamental. However, the lower the fundamental, the more audible are the overtones. This is what gives low notes their rich quality, because they are being reinforced by those overtones. This has been the A harmonic series that I've been showing you. Each fundamental frequency has its own. Another interesting property of the harmonic series is that as you go up, the intervals get closer and closer together. You'll notice that the first two are an octave apart, and then a perfect fifth, and then a perfect fourth, and then a major third, and then a minor third, and then so on. You'll notice that the perfect fifth shows up very early in the overtone series, suggesting a strong relationship between tonic and dominant, which is the basis of our tonal system. You'll also notice that the first three unique notes in any given harmonic series create a major chord. There's even a theory that suggests that the reason that so much of our music is based on major chords is because it's embedded into the harmonic series. But I'll let everyone debate that in the comments. Because the harmonic series is a naturally occurring process that actually occurs in nature, it doesn't conform to our 12-tone equal temperament system. So when you're listening to the harmonic series, some notes might seem out of tune. Some more than others. like the seventh partial of the A series. It's not really the G natural that we think of when we play a piano. And the 11th partial is almost exactly halfway between D and E flat, or like E flat and a half. As the notes get closer and closer together, every harmonic above the 16th partial is smaller than what we would call a half step. Next time we'll look at the math of intervals and a lot of other interesting things that we can do with the harmonic series. Until then, I've included a link in the description to a really fascinating lecture given by Leonard Bernstein on the harmonic series. It's well worth your time.
So it's important. Well, first of all, let me say it's not so important that you understand the math involved in it. It is actually fairly straightforward, and if you want to learn more about it, then really just Google harmonics or music theory, things like that. Pretty easy to find a lot of resources on that. What I wanted to point out is that please just kind of keep this in mind as we go through the various levels of the ray of creation, simply because you're going to start to see patterns. A couple of things that you're going to start to see. You're going to start to see octaves showing up, and you're going to start to see some of those numbers in a different form, like he was talking about the perfect fifth or the perfect third, I'm sorry, the minor third, and so on. These numbers begin to also show up as we go through the various aspects of the ray of creation. Yeah.
Is this what Leonard Cohen refers to in Hallelujah? The major fourth and the final? I mean, that's what it occurs to me. And I played piano years ago, but I don't remember this. But boy, he was referring to the ray of creation then. In a sense.
I don't have that quote or that specific reference, but I will say that our musical scale of do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si. Well, we've changed it to T, but originally it was si, do. Each of those are the beginning of a Latin phrase that really describes the ray of creation. So at the bottom end, you've got do for Dominus, re for Regina Coeli, I think is how it's said, something like that. Which is Latin for the ruler of the sky, in other words, the moon. Then you've got mi, which is short for microcosm or microcosm, right, which is the earth. Fa, fatum. The ancients believed that the planets ruled man's fate, and so fa or fatum was the note for the planets in our solar system. Sol means sun, right? La is short for lacte, in other words, milky or Milky Way. And Si, sidereal or sidereal, I think that's how it's said, meaning all stars, in other words, the universe. And then you've got Do again at the top, which is an octave above. So there's a bit of a reference there, Kate, it does tie in.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions before I move on here?
Actually, I had a thought that the harmonic series is about music, and the Fibonacci sequence is about geometry.
Yeah.
And that's also mathematically defined. So there's a lot of similarities in different ways of approaching it.
Yeah, one might almost say that the Fibonacci series is the musical notes of space in geometry, right? Yeah, good point. All right, I'm going to share a screen again. We're going to go back and forth on these screen shares. So, okay, let's start at the very top. Before when I went do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si, do, this is the high end of where we're starting. And think of the absolute, whatever you want to call that, as kind of that fundamental note that the guy was talking about in the video, right? It would be the base note of A in there. And really, at this level, everything is literally just a point. And this circle, this blue circle that I've got here, is a bit misleading because actually that would be a surface, but you can't draw a point on a diagram without any dimensions. If you can get your head around kind of that concept, though, fundamentally, that's what we're trying to illustrate here. And so in this realm, the will of the absolute and infinity and eternity are all combined. They're all together. There is only one law, okay? This quantum singularity that science, sometimes refers to would be a very close approximation of that. But really, it's so far outside of our experience with anything that it's pretty difficult to describe. The next step, so this would be the note do at the top of the scale, right? The next step is where there is a separation, and this would be the entire universe. And it's in this area that the three forces begin to divide. They're still unified from the standpoint that consciousness is a single force, infinity is a single force, and eternity is a single force. They haven't taken on any kind of multiplicity or movement yet, but this is the beginnings of that. And I guess the easiest way to say it from this standpoint of all galaxies or the universe is that the will of the absolute expands itself into infinity to create eternity. And this is why I have this kind of positive, negative, neutral aspect on the triangle in there. You'll also note that we begin to see some numbers, or at least I should say the potential for numbers starting to appear. The first one, if you take and follow, I'm going to turn on a pointer. Hang on one second here. If you take and follow this point 1, in other words, consciousness, down this line, you get 1 plus 1. Okay, so the first appearance of the potential for 2. It hasn't actually happened yet, but it's in potential at that point in time. Same thing with this one, consciousness expanding into eternity has that same 1 plus 1, and all three of them together produce the number 3. All right, so we have the appearance now in potential of 3 numbers. Now, the word universe is actually kind of interesting because it's a concatenation of 2 separate words. One, uni, just meaning single or one, right? And verse, which I don't remember the exact Latin word for it, but it means to rotate. Okay, so it's this idea of one beginning to rotate, and the first simplest shape that has that capability built into it is the triangle. Yeah, a line alternates. A triangle actually has the potential to rotate. Okay. Question so far? I'll carry on. Okay, next we get to, okay, and by the way, this is called World 3 because there are now three separate laws that are involved in this. Now we get to the next one, which is our galaxy, one of billions, likely. But we're kind of concerned with our own rate of creation. One way to think of this is like the trunk of a tree. You start off with the trunk of the tree, and that would be the absolute, and then you come across one particular branch, right? And that would be the well, I guess the trunk would actually be the universe. The first branch would be a galaxy, and so on and so forth. Okay, doesn't mean there aren't others. It's interesting to note at this level that consciousness remains the same. It's still a 1, okay? It's still a point. But now there's a separation. Time, actually I'm gonna switch this around. So space becomes a line and time becomes a surface. And again, we're still in the realms where this is really difficult to get our head around, that time, for instance, being a surface or space being a line. Now, one thing that I should have pointed out when we were watching, or just after we watched that video, is that the thing that causes these natural harmonics or these natural vibrations to appear is actually the fact that there are what are called nodes, okay? If you take a guitar as an example, if you pluck the string and it's not attached at one end, it's just going to flop, right? And so it actually requires that it is attached at 2 separate points in order to begin to vibrate. And I think something that I am still kind of consciously puzzling about is, what are those nodes for consciousness, specifically in the realms of the absolute or God or whatever you want to deem it. In other words, there's this kind of consciousness, but it needs some sort of resistance in order to be able to manifest into these multiple vibrations that begin to happen when consciousness is plucked. Yeah. Okay.
Could you go back to resistance?
Go back to resistance.
Yeah. Could you
Yeah.
explain a little bit more
Yeah, sure.
about resistance?
Yeah. So again, returning to my analogy of a guitar string, it has to have 2 points that are connected. That like at the fret, at the nut, and at the base of the guitar, right? And if one of those is not connected, in other words, if one of those doesn't offer resistance, then the string won't vibrate. It won't resonate. It will just flop. Yeah. So it actually takes kind of this tension and 2 areas of resistance in order for it to do that. Now, once you pluck the guitar string, the ray of creation for that string goes into motion, because not only does it create its fundamental frequency, right, its fundamental note, A, for example, but simultaneous to being plucked, everything else, its octave is produced, its perfect fifth, its perfect fourth, so on and so forth, are all produced simultaneously. And this is what gives the sound of each musical instrument its unique quality, is which ones are amplified and which ones are a bit dampened in there. But yeah, this resistance in there is really kind of a fascinating aspect to me that I'm still working out in there. What in the absolute could create that kind of resistance? Did that help a bit?
I'm just trying to make a connection between resistance inside of the people who are achieving something, to resistance, what you were saying about.
Yeah.
When you resist, you want to achieve something and you start to resist it. It's like 2 opposites.
Yeah. And this is something we'll get into about the maybe as I can. I'm gonna mute here. Maybe as I continue, it will become a little bit more clear.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. Couple of points that I want to make. So the universe sees each galaxy in the Milky Way. I'm sorry, each galaxy the way that we see the moon, right? Each universe is orbiting around, each galaxy is orbiting around the universe. Interestingly enough, too, this is the lowest point in creation that the absolute, in other words, that single point of consciousness, can observe. And I'll show what that means as we get into the harmonics of more and more layers. And down here, we have the second and third harmonics, what would be called the second and third harmonics. The second harmonic of space would be a line, right? This is also an example of where this resistance comes in. And the third harmonic of time would be a surface at that point. Now, what's really important to understand, this is a bit difficult to explain, so bear with me in this, but from this standpoint, everything is material. We talked about, pardon me, we talked about the E equals MC squared aspect of it earlier, and the most important thing to understand about that is that E equals M, okay? So if there's something energetic, it is also material and vice versa. It's just a matter of which end of the bar that it's in. And so when I say things like the matter of space is already twice as dense and the matter of time is already 3 times as dense, it would be helpful for you to be able to conceptualize space and time as some sort of quantitative thing instead of qualitative, as we tend to observe it. Okay, it's a useful mental tool. That's all I'm trying to say. Okay, now we start to see some interesting patterns as we get to our sun, which would be world 12. And by the way, if you take these, take these things like force 2 plus force 4 plus force 6 equals 12. That's what I'm talking about when I say world 12. It's subject to 12 orders of magnitude or 12 orders of laws at this point in time, being subject to the realms or the laws introduced higher and higher up the ray of creation. And now we get into some interesting things. We see that the absolute takes on this sort of dualistic nature. And it makes me wonder if this is where the ideas associated in religion, with like good and evil, God and the devil, so on and so forth, all this dualism that appears in religion, has its origin in this diminished perception of what the absolute actually is, right? It takes on this dualistic nature. And I do mean a diminished perception, because the more divisions you cause, the more laws something comes under. One way to look at it is it becomes more and more diminished in its ultimate form. From this standpoint, space takes on the nature of a circus, really, and more of a quadratic. It's 4 times as dense, and time takes on a 6-dimensional nature. Now, I'd like to talk about those 6 dimensions for a moment, because we're all used to thinking in terms of past, present, and future. But from the standpoint of the sun, there is such a thing called a solar year. And a solar year is the amount of time that it takes for our sun to orbit the entire Milky Way galaxy of which it is a part, okay? Just like our planet, orbiting the Earth is a year. Our planet orbiting the sun is a year. The sun orbits the Milky Way galaxy in about 230 million of our years, okay? So that would be the concept of a solar year. A solar day would be about 640,000. In other words, now I'm going to say, because I'm dividing that 230 million years by 360. In other words, I'm assuming a perfect circle. It probably isn't. It probably is a bit more oval, just like our year is 365 days, because we're not an exact circle. But when you're dealing in thousands of years or hundreds of thousands of years, the difference is going to be fairly slight. And then a solar hour of 26,000 years. But you see, from the diagram here, we're beginning to introduce dimensionality. And we don't live in a world right now where it's easy for us to conceptualize something that is just a line, that is just 2-dimensional. The best way to think about it is imagine that you are an ant walking on a string, and in front of you is an ant, and behind you is an ant, but you are unable to walk right or to look right or left, okay? So your perception of reality is just that which is in front of you. That would be kind of the closest approximation to what 2-dimensional space might be like. Yeah, can't see behind you, can't see right, left, can't see up, down, those types of things. The idea of space becoming 4-dimensional is really a line in extension. So you start off with a line, and if you continue to multiply that line on one particular axis or another, you end up with what's known as a surface. And if you then take that surface and begin to multiply it in different dimensions or axes, then you end up with something 6-sided, right? Which would be a cube. We've got top, bottom, and the 4 sides in there, okay? Moving on now, we enter the realm of all planets, and some more interesting things begin to show up, because at this level, you start to think of the will of the absolute or consciousness taking on a 4-fold nature. And we can find examples of that in like ancient art, for instance, the Sphinx, and the idea of the bull, bird, lion, and serpent that occur throughout kind of, the 4 elements. You've got adhesion, cohesion, repulsion, and attraction, which would be 4 aspects of force. You've got the 4 seasons, and so on and so forth, okay? Time is now 12 times as dense. And again, it's helpful to think about a unit of time as like, a molecule of time in the absolute would be equivalent to 1, but a molecule of time here, 12 times denser than that. Or it would be, another way to think of it would be the 12th harmonic, for instance. Okay. Right, so now we've got past, present, future, year, day, and hour, and these are the 6 that were kind of introduced in the octave above, right? In the octave of the sun, but now we also introduce new things to it: winter, spring, summer, fall, day, and night. Thinking about it from the standpoint of a planetary experience, or all planets in our solar system, you can begin to see that just like our Earth, depending on what part of its rotational orbit it is, it takes on one of 4 seasons, okay? The winter, spring, summer, fall. But also because of its own rotation, it also takes on an aspect of day and night. And each planet that rotates in our solar system experiences this. It's interesting to note this too. Our moon always presents the same face to us constantly. Okay, so its rotation is actually interlocked with us. This is why we never see the dark side of the moon in that. That's another indication that it's under kind of more restrictions as far as that goes. It doesn't have seasons from that standpoint. It just has 2, winter and summer, right? Okay. Now we enter our world, and this is where the diagrams, or I'm sorry, the geometric symbols start getting more and more complex to the point where they're almost not something that we can display anymore, but you get the idea. Okay, now the consciousness of the absolute takes on an octave nature. And I find it fascinating how often the number 8 shows up, not just in Christianity or Judaism, but actually in every religion. Even like the I Ching of Taoist cosmology, okay, is an 8-fold structure, right? But a lot of times it represents things like new beginnings when you find it in religious literature. There are 8 persons aboard Noah's Ark. The day of circumcision in Judaism is the 8th day after a child is born. In Greek, Jesus comes out to 888.
May I interject that in paganism, we have the 8 seasons. We have the 2 solstices, the 2 equinoxes, and the fire festivals in between.
Yeah, absolutely. Wonderful. Yeah, so there's tons and tons of examples of it, but again, this kind of consciousness of the divine or consciousness of the absolute at our level is 8 times as dense and 8 times more multiplicity, right, involved in that. Our planet perceives space as 16-dimensional. In other words, 16 times denser and 24 times denser in the or in time. Now, specifically our planet, the number 24, as far as the dimensionality goes, is quite easy to see, right? We have a 24-hour day. It takes 24 hours for our ball to spin around once and get day and night on both sides. And finally, we get to the bottom end of the ray of creation. And the point that I want to make here is that from the standpoint of the laws, this is where it's most restrictive. Like I started off by saying, the moon orbits the planet, which orbits the sun, which is part of the body of the solar system, which orbits the sun, which orbits the Milky Way, which orbits the universe, which orbits the absolute. So see these kind of various layers, the do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si, do type of thing in there. This is not to say that the absolute is good and the moon is bad. That's a very dualistic way of approaching it. I want this to become a bit more conceptual rather than literal, because it does actually refer to levels of consciousness. As one begins to develop and grow in one's levels of consciousness or conscious awareness, it's not always a process of growing into something, but shedding something. Okay, and I love to use the analogy of the story of King Arthur and the sword and the stone, because it's a bit allegorical of this process. The idea behind that, or the esoteric idea behind that, is that there's this stone or this sword that is cast into a stone, right? And as the story goes, only the rightful king or ruler that had the right kind of assemblies in himself would come along and be able to remove the sword from the stone. From an occult or esoteric standpoint, you can think of it as that at planetary level, the idea of a sword being embedded in a stone being unremovable, it's under a certain amount of laws, right? That it can't be withdrawn from there. But someone coming along with more of a connection to the solar realms, okay, a solar or sun level type of consciousness, has embodied with them the ability to suspend the 48 laws of the planet in favor of the 12 of the sun and be able to remove that. So it's an analogy. Does that kind of make sense? The idea behind there? Yeah, esoteric. Yeah, so 48 times denser than eternity. Now, again, it's not important at this phase or at this stage to really understand the math as much as it is to understand the idea of scale, that each level goes higher and higher and higher. And we started off with certain numbers, and I'll say that every one of the natural laws, of which at our level, in other words, planetary level, there are 48 orders of these laws, really can be reduced to a number. And that's going to be important. And like I said, this particular lesson is not going to cover all 48 orders of laws. That would you'd be here for the next 2 days straight. Okay, so I'm just going to pick one that we're going to go into. But at this point in time, I'm going to stop sharing and just open it up for any kind of questions that you guys might have so far. I know it's been a bit of a long walk through the universe here for a minute.
Well, I kind of wanted to talk a little bit more about the duality, the will of the absolute, because I think duality can even be more than that. You know, we've got night, day, yin, yang, male, female. So I just kind of wanted to throw that in as a little bit more of an earth perspective.
So yeah, and that's actually, you're right in tune with the direction that I want to go with it, because I want to talk about or really take a little bit deeper of a dive into the law of two today as an introduction for it. Each of the laws, up to 8, are kind of fundamental. I did start off with saying that, you know, the 3 most fundamental ones are the law of 1, or the law of unity, the law of 3, and the law of 7. But that only happens at the realm of you know, just below the universal realm, where those start to become apparent. Anything above that is just literally the law of unity, right, where everything is one. Anything below that introduces different laws, like the law of duality, right, the law of 2. The law of 3, which would be related to the cosmic triangle that we were showing in there, that positive, negative, and neutralizing force. The law of 4, which, here's where it starts to get interesting, because 4 can be composed of 1 plus 3, or it can be composed of 2 plus 2, okay? But in these realms, because of the types of forces at play, in other words, the law of 3 being more fundamental, it would never be 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1, you know, from a law standpoint. But if you want to understand and explore, for example, the law of 4, you can see how consciousness interacts with time, for example, that 1 plus 3, or how consciousness interacts with space. Yeah, so kind of breaking it down into its component parts. The law of 5, the symbol of which is the pentagram. Everyone's familiar with that. And again, that's composed of 1 plus 4 or 2 plus 3. So those fundamental laws kind of coming into play. Law of 6, which would be the symbol for that, would be the Star of David, right? The upward and downward pointing triangles would be 1 plus 5, 2 plus 4, or 3 plus 3, and so on and so forth. Okay. Now, anything above 8 which is a complete octave from 1 to 8. Anything above that is always going to be combinations. One good example is the Enneagram, which I don't know if you guys can see this. I kind of have a partial Enneagram put up here. If you can't see it, if you're not familiar with the term Enneagram, just Google it. But that's actually composed of 2 different symbols. One is the symbol for the law of 7, which I do have up here, which is that 1, 4, 2, 8, 5, 7, 1 interconnecting area, and the other is the triangle superimposed upon it. So the law of 3 and the law of 7 coming together to form what might be called the law of 9, but it's really not exactly accurate to call it that. It's more of like how 3 and 7 interact. And circle's a part of it too, so you've got 1 in there as well. Okay, so why is this important? Well, to me it's important because if the laws are fundamental to all of creation, and if the planet inherits a certain number of laws from the octaves above it, then really an understanding of the laws is an understanding of the way the planet speaks or the way she sings, right? It's her mode of expression. And as humans, we have the ability to be able to get on the same frequency as things. I'll give you an example. And I love bringing this up, okay? So when I was a child, one of my favorite things to do, it's a very strong memory in me, is I used to love to pretend that I was a bear, yeah? And I would be in my room, you know, which in my mind, in my imagination, transformed itself into a cave, you know, and I'd walk around doing that, right? I mean, humans have this amazing ability to actually connect to things. You never see a cat or a dog, for example, you know, grab a suitcase and I'm sorry, briefcase, and you know, head out the door being, all right, goodbye, going to work now, right? But we see humans doing this. We have this ability to engage in something called the tuning fork principle. And the tuning fork principle is as follows. If I have a tuning fork, do you all know what a tuning fork is? It's just like a little metal device with a stick at one end and 2 prongs at the other end, right? Just like that. If I have a tuning fork tuned to the note of A, and I give you one tuned to the note of A, and I strike mine, if you listen carefully to yours also brings in sympathy to it. Now, that's a specific example of the tuning fork principle, but I think it's important to understand that humans naturally have this. We have this ability to get ourselves on the frequency of something. And if you get yourself on the frequency of the laws, then so many new revelations, so much inspiration, so much joy, so much just vibrancy begins to come into your life because of doing that. And the way you do it is really quite simple. You just look for them. Once you have kind of an understanding of what the laws are, begin to collect examples. And Judith, I think you were the one talking about this a little bit earlier, of day, night, you know, black, white, up, down, right, left, male, female, so on and so forth. That's exactly the process that I'm actually suggesting here, is get a notebook and begin to, you know, if you decide, okay, I'm going to spend the next month or 2 months or whatever, however long, doesn't matter, really looking for examples of the law of 2. What that's going to do is it's going to attract that fundamental influence of the true nature of the law of 2 in the universe into you, into your aura, into the nature of you. We all know this is actually true from the standpoint that, let's say that you're looking to buy a new car, and you have something picked out, right? You want a gray Honda, whatever the case is, whatever the kind of car it is. Now, you're driving around town and you've got this thought going on in your mind that you want this specific vehicle. And everywhere you go, everywhere you look, suddenly you begin to see them. It's almost like, wow, there's one, and there's one, and there's one, and there's one, and there's one, right? Now, they may or may not have been there before, and we can get into a quantum argument at some point as to whether or not they are. But the fact is that because your faculties are now attuned to that which you seek, you begin to see more. You begin to become kind of open to more, right? Open to that which is around you. So yeah, my suggestion, fall in love with the laws and absolutely get a notebook and just start filling it with examples, that, I mean, literally can be easy. Up, down, right, left, male, female, yeah, all that type of stuff. I'm going to actually, with the law of two, I'll give you 7, today I will give you 7 sort of areas to look at in the law of two, all right, that might stimulate your curiosity. But the point is to get to know them by instinct, right? So that every time you interact with something, every time you see something, you are learning something new about the laws, about the way the universe works. Trust me, it's so amazing. If you haven't done it, just try it. And the thing is, the laws explain everything, right? Everything, all the complexity that we see in this world of 48 orders of laws, or in the moon of 96 orders of laws, all goes back to the fundamentals in the beginning. And really, if you understand the laws, you'll be able to trace what is true and what isn't in your life. It's hard to put it any simpler than that, because, and what I mean by what is true from the standpoint of the origins of things, right? You begin to understand the universe, begin to understand creation better. And to some degree, once you do, you can basically speak on any natural subject without having to go, study for 20 years in college or something like that, because they all resort back to the natural laws. Kate, you popped up on my screen. Did you have a question? No, you just randomly showed up. Okay. Well, now I'm chatting with you. Before it was Judith, so that's good. So from a planetary level, the law of two is set up and made certain by the law of three. In other words, it's an aspect of the law of three. The law of three is actually more fundamental, and I'm going to draw this out a bit. The law of two at our level has another name, which is the law of things adjacent. We tend to think of male and female, up, down, right, left, light, dark, all that type of stuff as being opposites of one another. But in actuality, they're not. They are adjacent to one another, and I'll show you what I mean by that. Can you guys see this? Should I scoot it close? Here, I'm going to try and scoot it closer without wrecking it. Can you guys see the whiteboard? Somewhat? I'll draw big, okay? All right. I'm going to get rid of all this. Okay, here's what I mean by adjacent. This has to do with the levels that we were just talking about in the ray of creation, where you get these octaves. And understand that the human mind is actually much more energetic than it is material. It's more of an energy type of being trapped in a physical body, okay? And so a lot of you might be familiar with this as being the symbol for the planet or the symbol for physicality. As you go up an octave, you can think of it as this being the symbol for the sun, okay, or for sun level perception. In other words, it's a shift off axis of the physical, okay? It's more electrical, more energetic. And if our mind sits here on this point, then when we look at things in the physical world, if we look left, we see, female or male, whatever the case is. If we look right, we see male. We look left, we see up. We look right, we see down. Left, right, up, down, male, female. All of these types of things that appear to be opposites are only opposites because of our perception is tilted on access to the physical world, okay? And so we look in these opposite directions and we see these, but what you'll realize is that in reality, they all have their origin at the same point, okay? Our world doesn't have anything that's dualistic in it at this level. They're all adjacent. Male and female are aspects of gender. Up and down are aspects of direction. Light and dark are aspects of luminosity. and so on and so forth. It's difficult to picture what the opposite of male would be, but it would actually be completely genderless and completely, humanless, if you follow where I'm going with this. Okay. So the planetary name for the law of two is the law of things adjacent. Now, let's see. So the first level of the law.
Pierce,
Yeah.
can I ask a question? This is
Yes,
Rose. Hi.
Didn't know you were on.
So, oh yeah, thanks. I've just been silent because I was in the middle of something when you started, and I just was listening. Anyway, so the law of adjacent or two, but if you think of even male, female, maybe that's a good, maybe dark, light. There's not just those two aspects. It's generally a spectrum of things, or
Yes.
more than two. So how do you account for that? It just seems very simplistic. I don't know if I follow because it's so simplistic.
Right. What you're saying is actually the point that I'm trying to get across, is that they are adjacent, right? If you're stuck in this kind of dualism in oneself, that's a level of consciousness, if I can describe it this way, that is more restrictive than seeing them as they truly are, which would be adjacent, or even a scale of things, as you're suggesting, Rose. So yeah, perfect. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
But it is how it appears, right? I mean, to give an example, in the idea of morals and the idea of especially dogmatic morals, right, where there is, in religions or in dogmas, I should say, this idea of right and wrong, very clear, black and white, right and wrong, that type of stuff. That's a much lower on the scale than maybe perhaps looking at things as either useful or not useful, right, towards an aim, which introduces a third vector. We discussed this last time. Or, for example, not looking at what people do, but looking at why they do it. Yeah, I mean, we say, oh, lying is bad, and this is good. Always telling the truth is good. Lying is bad, and so on and so forth. And that puts us in this back and forth type of consciousness, where nothing can be accomplished except for a ping pong game in your own development. Right? Just back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. It takes that third vector of, for example, in this illustration, understanding the reason why a person does something, that takes you out of that, and also gives you that first shape, that triangle, the first shape where movement can occur instead of just alternation. Okay. But yeah, the lowest level of the law of two is the apparent duality that we see around us in everything. The second level of the law of two is what's called the split, and I'm going to draw something else here. I got to stand up for this. Okay, the way the split happens, it's going to take probably some time to really begin to see and collect examples of this. I hope not. I mean, it took me a long time to be able to actually to collect good examples of this, but the way the split happens is this. If you have force or something moving in a particular direction, like this, then at a certain point in time, when it reaches its maximum, can you guys see this diagram, by the way? Yeah, it's just two downward arrows, okay? At a certain point in time, a reflection happens. And this is what's called the split, where that force begins to split in half and rebound upon itself, okay? And then the third aspect of that is that both halves then flip over, and you end up with something moving in opposite directions, okay? So phase one, force moving in one particular direction. Phase two, a bucking happens. Phase three, a deviation or a moving in different directions type of thing happens. I'm not going to belabor a bunch of examples because I do want you to get notebooks and try and find these. However, if you've ever dropped a pebble into a pond, that's one example of that, of what happens. When you drop a pebble into a pond, the waves begin to go out this way. And once they hit their stopping point, the edge of the shore, if you will, or whatever, edge of the pond, a reflection happens where one wave is still going this direction, one now is returning towards this direction. Once those two meet, they reverse, and then you get one half of it going to the source of its arising and one half trying to continue back this way. And now I'm just going to hint that it is also the same with the directions of north, south, east, west, but not from the standpoint of like you would see on a map, right? Not flat, but the fact that north and south is one pole, one line of force, if you will, okay, of magnetic energy basically going through the sphere of the planet. And the idea of east and west is the planet's rotation, okay, which introduces the idea of the third level or third aspect of the law of two, which is pitching and yawing. Who here is familiar with like boat, right? When you're sailing, not only are you pitching in one direction, but you're also doing this yawing movement. This is another aspect of the law of two that's rises above and beyond the point of apparent duality, right? It's now taken on a completely different nature to it. Good question so far.
Yeah, Pierce, I understand the pitching and yawning. I'm a sailor, and the waves in the ocean, but I'm not quite understanding the rotation of the Earth, the east-west, because they seem to continuously go the same direction. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, that's kind of the end result of the pitch. I'm sorry, of the split. Okay, so you have the magnetic force or electric force going through the planet, south to north actually, but it doesn't matter, north to south this way, which in it causes a second vector of movement. Okay, going around this way. You can look for references to this in the laws of electromagnetism, where you've got electric current flowing one way and you have the magnetic field flowing another way. That's another example of that kind of.
Right. So the three-dimensionality of it is what I wasn't quite getting. Got it.
Yeah. Okay, good. Yep. Right. So if you're taking notes, then the first level, if you will, of the law of two would be apparent duality. The second level would be the split, and the third level would be pitching and yawing. Okay. The fourth level is where we begin to become magicians. And what I mean by magicians is the ability to interact with the laws and cause results. The first three levels kind of happen under natural conditions anyway. The fourth level is called balance and movement. And I'll give you an example. So everything in nature, everything in life is always alternating between a point of balance and a point of movement. To walk across the room, you constantly go back and forth between those two aspects. All right. At one point in time, you're in a state of balance, but in order to move, you have to get out of balance, right? And then you take another step, which causes balance and movement constantly. Now, if we're going to get a bit more philosophical at this point, I want you to imagine a spinning top, okay? You have it going, and it's kind of like traveling along in a certain direction. Now, you all know, if you've played with a top before, that if you just try to bump it in a new direction, it'll spin out of control in some random unknown way, right? The only way to change its direction is to stop it, okay? To put it in a condition of balance, and then spin it again or cause movement in it again in the intended direction. This, from a psychological standpoint, is the difference between initiative and knowledgeable pressure. Initiative is kind of a lower form of tapping the top while it's already in motion. you see a situation in your life that you wish to redirect or re-guide, and you decide, okay, I'm going to do something about this, right? And you begin to apply unknowledgeable pressure, in other words, initiative to it without actually causing it to stop first. It flies off in any one of 360 different directions, doesn't it? Right? But knowledgeable pressure is to stop the situation, stop the movement of it, and start it somewhere fresh. Examples of this are absolutely everywhere. I mean, again, this is a fundamental aspect of the law of two, balance of movement. If you're in an argument with somebody, for example, you're all spiritual, so I'm sure you don't argue, right? We're all spiritual. We never argue, do we? No, but the idea is, you don't just try to change someone's mind in the force of that argument. That's initiative, right? Knowledgeable pressure would be to stop what's moving in them, stop what's moving in you, have everything come to a balance point, and then reconstruct that situation in a new direction. Okay, I'm just throwing out a bunch of examples here so that you get on the tuning fork frequency of it. Yeah. Fairly self-explanatory. So level 5 would be termed solve and coagula, or fluid and fixed. And it's different from balance and movement. Our body does this, okay? Like our blood system, for example, is in a state of solve. It's in a state of solvent where it's flowing. Right? And if you run, then it's even in a higher state of fluidness, right? But if you cut yourself, what happens? The blood goes from solve to coagula. It begins to heal itself by clotting, yeah, at the surface of the injury, where that is. We use terms in a funny way sometimes, like, for example, to solve your problem. Does that mean that if you have a problem, it's in a state of coagula, right, or of coagulation inside of you, and it needs some sort of fluid aspect to it? I just think it's a really, really curious term that we use. We use the word solve not only to be fluid, but also to, problematic hurdle. Okay, level 6, or the next level up, would be over and under compensation. This is everywhere. This is actually super easy to see, right? Almost invariably, when we try to do something that we are uncomfortable with or have a difficult time doing, we go into this alternation of over and under compensation, right? Just look for examples. It's it's one of the easier ones to find, but we tend to overcompensate in one direction, and then we undercompensate in the opposite direction, and so on and so forth. You can even see it in sports. If you're playing basketball, if you're learning to play basketball, for example, it is an experiment in over and under compensation, right? You throw the ball once and you go over the rim. You throw the ball a second time and you're too short. Third, fourth, fifth, it's this tuning in of an aspect of over and under compensation. This is actually how we learn, through the process of over and under compensation. And I'm going to remain with the example of throwing a ball for a moment, because if you think about the difference between the way a computer might, or a robot might, achieve the task of throwing a basketball into a hoop, that would all be calculations. That would just be calculations of, this vector and that vector and how much force and possibly wind resistance and so on and so forth. That's not how we learn, though, right? We learn by refining our over and under compensation, and this applies everywhere. We overcompensate, then we go a bit back in the opposite direction. We undercompensate until eventually, if you hit the pro level of being a basketball player, in my example, you get to the point where you appear almost to be like a robot, like you calculated it out, but it's not that. It's a method of continual refinement. Okay. All right. The last aspect to look at in the law of two would be what would be called coming and going, something moving away or moving towards oneself. In the realms of physics, You can think of like blue shift and red shift. Yeah, blue shift stars are I believe the blue shift stars are the ones that are coming towards you, right? The Doppler effect. The red shift ones are the ones going away from you. And this is one of those that actually is only a matter of perspective, which direction you look at it from. If, for example, you're on the planet Earth and you see, through your telescope, what would be called a redshift star, that means that it's moving away from you, from your perspective, from your point of view. But if you're on the other side of the universe, you would see it as a blue shift star. Another example of this type of coming and going combination would be looking at a spiral, right? Watching water go down a drain, for example. In the northern hemisphere, it goes in a clockwise fashion. But if you look at it from the opposite side, it looks like it's going counterclockwise, right? If I do this, I don't know, you can try this on your own. If you do this movement and you look down on it, it's going clockwise. If you keep the movement going, it's now going counterclockwise, okay? So again, this is expanding outside of the law of two by understanding various ways that it shows up on this planet. Right. Questions? What do you want to dive into a bit more? This is the end, by the way, except for questions. Do you think it's enough? Should I have gone through the law of three a bit more and then four? We'll do that in upcoming ones. I just think this was quite a lot, actually.
Right, and I like the idea of really looking for it. I've already come up with, dozens of examples in my head, but I think more than finding the examples is the awareness of it, the practice of being conscious. And been practicing that for a while and could use a little bit more. So I look forward to that. Thank you.
Yeah, good. It's important to approach things in a very natural way. I mean, literally play with it. Humans have children have such a great way of approaching the natural laws. They go out and play with things. That is the fundamental way to explore the natural laws. When I was a kid, I was fascinated for a great deal of time about crushing rocks, right? I'd get a big rock, and I'd get a pile of little rocks, and I'd smash them, and they'd break apart. And every once in a while, you'd hit one that sparked, and that was my favorite part, right? This is what it's like, though, is just to go out and actually play with these things. Probably one of the most deadening things a human can do is to just go read about it somewhere, right? There's so many books out there on, like, for example, numerology, or so many books out there on color, or symbols, or this type of stuff, that we think we know it, but we don't know it unless we know it from the inside out. And that just happens with actually playing with it.
I've said this before, but the more you know you don't know.
That's true. Yeah. And you know that you're on the right track with playing with the laws and trying to understand these types of things if you experience joy in it. That's like actually one of the fundamental aspects. This is why I call it playing with the laws instead of like work. You're not going to a job like, oh God, I have to collect 800 examples of the law of two. No, fall in love with it. And what you'll notice is that it keeps you up at night, but you don't mind it, right? You become inspired, which is actually a higher state of consciousness. And isn't that what this is about, right? We're trying to grow ourselves, trying to lighten the load.
And the way I think of it is that we are divine creatures, spiritual beings having an earthly experience. And that the point of it all is the universe trying to know itself better in all aspects, good and bad.
Very true. Yeah.
Hopefully evolving.
Yeah, and really, to me, there's a strong aspect, like I said before, there's a strong aspect of the idea of development is actually shedding things, not necessarily acquiring things, but shedding the lower levels of, how these laws, for example, manifest here versus how they might manifest as one gets nearer to the core of creation. I'll give you a good example. Now, I can tell you this, I can tell all of you this, but until you actually experience it as a fact in your own lives, it won't have the same kind of weight that it does in me. But I'll give you an example. This has to do with dimensionality, dimensions, okay? Every being in the universe actually sees itself as three-dimensional no matter where it is, because that is one of the conditions of having a body, which I said is an organization of various qualities kind of clumped together, okay? So you see yourself as three-dimensional, but if I'm standing in front of you, because I'm removed from you, you actually no longer see me the way you see yourself. In other words, if you become self-conscious, self-aware at the moment, you're aware of all of your body, inside, outside, the back, the top, the front, everywhere, okay, simultaneously. But when you look at me, I lose one dimension of it and I become a surface. And more so the farther you get. So now let's take it from the example of you look at the sun. Now you know that the sun is a sphere in and of itself. It actually is a body. It's a three-dimensional body. You're aware of this, but you've never actually probably experienced it as such. Because when you look up at the sun, or actually don't do that, look up at the moon, what you're actually seeing is it losing one dimension. It becomes a surface, okay? And as you look up even further, now we're going to look up at the Milky Way instead. What does it appear as? It appears as a line through the sky, right? If you've ever been in a dark camping or something like that, and you look up, the Milky Way is a line in the sky. But it's not like that in reality. That's just because we're distancing ourselves again from, even farther away from that level of the ray of creation. And then you look up even further and you try and see something even more distant, a star within the Milky Way galaxy. And what does it become? It becomes a point. And then eventually it just disappears altogether, doesn't it? Yeah.
All a matter of perspective.
Can no longer perceive it. So now I say this because quite literally, as you develop in levels of consciousness, and there are levels of conscious awareness that the human can achieve. When, for example, you become conscious at the level of all planets, you perceive that body as being a three-dimensional thing. You are actually part of that three-dimensional body. And an odd thing happens. The planet then becomes a surface for you, and you become a point. Okay? You lose perspectives in one direction by gaining one in another. When you take on the consciousness perception level of a solar level of consciousness, for example, something very odd happens, because you would think that you would feel like a sphere in space, but you don't. You actually feel like a line. And the reason why is because the sun is a rod through time. Time loses one level of dimensionality in that. And so the way that you perceive yourself, if you have a solar consciousness, is as a rod through time. And you no longer perceive the planets as points, you perceive them as solid rings that surround you. And you see where I'm going with this. So it's literally, when I say levels of consciousness in the realms of the ray of creation, these are actualities. This is not symbolic. This is actually having levels of awareness that incorporate, for instance, the entire solar system or the entire galaxy within which we live. And what goes along with that is a certain type of feeling and experiencing a more energetic level, right? Because the higher you go up in the ray of creation, the more energetic things become. The lower you go, the more dense things become, the more you're kind of married to this physicality in your perceptions. All right?
Kate has a question.
Hi, Kate.
Would you give an example of what you would suspect the Dalai Lama's level of consciousness is?
Mm-mm.
I'd like some kind of clear example of what you might perceive this to be.
In all honesty, I really can't, because not having met him, and I haven't, so I really wouldn't know. I'm not being evasive about it. I'm actually just being very truthful. I just don't know.
Well, one of my friends has met him, and what she said is that he just has a very lightness of being, and I think that's a value in itself.
Yeah.
Well, I've actually heard him. I've been in his presence, and I was kind of shocked to find out he was so humorous. He's hilarious, and he's so self-effacing and humble. It was like I couldn't believe, with all the drama around his security and everything, he was just like, he goes, why are you here? I'm just a simple man. And we're all going, really? We're here because we revere you and honor you. But he's very self-effacing. But I was just curious to kind of get a perspective on what you might.
Yeah, I hate to disappoint you, but I honestly have just no opinion on it. I don't know. I will say this, though, about this goes along with the ray of creation, and what I talked about with dimensionality is that the higher can see the lower, but the lower can't see the higher. From the standpoint of, you could be sitting next to somebody on a bus who is very high up, in their consciousness level, but unless you have something in yourself that can resonate with that, some sort of tuning fork with that, you're not going to register it or see it. Yeah.
So it's kind of a mirroring situation, because I've been with people that I believe have been extraordinarily powerful energetically.
Could be you.
I don't have the specifics of what we talked about today, perhaps in that perspective, but I can tell the difference. Or people that are just kind of blank. You feel that they're just doing the best they can.
Yeah.
So, okay.
Yeah, but I mean, anything you perceive has to be in you first. You can't perceive something that's not in you, right?
Yeah. Okay.
Good.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
I have sort of a thing that I was thinking about, and I've been sort of into audio and things, and there's a sort of a waveform concept that happens that's called phase cancellation.
Yes.
And in your diagram up there, where you're saying that, say like the example where you drop the stone into water and the waves propagate out from that, and they hit the shore, and they're saying that then they reflect back. But there's an aspect of phase cancellation where if your peak of your waveform and the trough of the waveform come together, they just stop.
Right.
The energy is opposite and therefore cancels out.
So here's another perspective on that. They don't stop. They enter another octave. Think about it in the terms of light and whether or not you could. Okay, it doesn't actually work like this. I mean, going into the physics of it, but if you had one wave of light in a particular phase, and you broadcast at it another wave of light in 180 degree phase shifted, you would think that they would cancel each other out and you would just have darkness. But if you have darkness, where's the energy going? Right? This is the idea, and also actually with the idea of the fundamental note, as we talked about in the octave of the absolute, generating all of these other harmonics. It actually does have to do with the cancellation. And this is what creates the various octaves. Phase cancellation, for instance, if you pluck a guitar string, you get your fundamental wave, right? If you lightly dampen or phase cancel the right in the center of the guitar string, what you're doing when you pluck it is you dampen the fundamental harmonic, but you add energy into the second harmonic. If you do it
that's more of actually getting your harmonics. You're canceling out the back part of the wavelength from being heard, but giving it like a half waveform.
Yeah.
That is actually audible.
Right, but the point is, it's audible to you because we can hear that spectrum of things. But in the example of the ray of creation, where we're dealing literally with seven octaves in there, anything that gets dampened in one octave will create harmonics in the lower rays of, or lower levels of the ray of creation. So the energy disappears from up here, right? Think about it this way: the absolute, one wave, right? The absolute, through some act of will or consciousness, dampens that and creates the next level down, which is now two waves, or I should say one wave twice as high in frequency. Third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh harmonics, and so on and so forth. So in an esoteric example of this, I guess what I'm trying to get at is that the idea of wave cancellation strengthens it in another region.
Okay, it's more of perhaps where it just becomes a different form of wavelength in a sense.
That's right, and ultimately, that's what yields our material universe from this point. Because so here's another concept that I wasn't sure I was going to bring up today, but I will. It has to do with, you can think of every particle in the universe, every atom, every proton, every electron, neutron, and molecule, and so on and so forth, as standing waves of energy. Now, this goes back to the ancient concept of the ether, because if energy travels through space, it has to have a medium to travel through. But if you've ever taken like a styrofoam cup filled with coffee or some other fluid, and you drag it across kind of a rough surface, you get this example of what standing waves are, right? It almost looks like this weird surface that doesn't go away. That's called a standing wave. Take that to the subatomic realms, and you can begin to see how energy actually becomes matter, because it's reflecting inward, spiraling, and reflecting backward, and bumping against other material around it, and you get this whole universe of standing waves. That's one level. If you look up at a star in the sky, you realize that the fact that you see the star means that you are seeing the physical aspect of it, but not necessarily seeing the energetic aspect of it. So, for example, how do I put this? For example, every star that you see out there in the galaxy, that aspect that you're seeing is actually under 48 laws. That particular part of it is under 48 laws. In other words, planetary laws, where it's more material than energetic. That aspect of it doesn't mean that you're seeing the whole thing, though. Something to think about. Are you a scientist, John?
No, I've just been interested in a lot of different things.
That's great.
I'm a luthier, and I build speaker cabinets, and sort of got into high-end audio for a while.
This must have been. You could probably teach this group about sound and stuff, right? Waves are waves.
That's true.
I went to school for electrical engineering, so my context is different, but still waves are waves. What else? Who else wants to chime in? I think we'll probably wrap up here soon. Have you enjoyed it? Has it been useful?
We'll have to consider what you let it mull over for a while, I think.
Yeah. Good. Yeah.
Yes,
I'm going to find the recording and look it over again.
Yeah. And so I'll do this, but next week I'll do the law of three, and we'll just, so this was a bit foundational, right? Because I've tried to teach about the laws before, and invariably I get this, someone in the group will be like, well, I don't believe in laws, as though they're man-made. Like, well, I refuse to adhere to these laws. And so what I wanted to do is kind of give an idea that the laws are the natural result of a vibrating universe, really. And what we perceive as physicality, what we perceive as things like the law of two, the law of three, so on and so forth, are harmonics of that one first principle in there. So I hope this has been a more useful introduction. I've gone around in circles about how to introduce the concept of the laws many, many times.
No, this has been great. Thanks, Pierce.
Yeah, sure.
All right,
Certainly.
thank you.
Yeah.
I'll only be able to join you for the first hour next week because I have another Zoom ritual at 1, but I look forward to it.
Fair enough. There will if technology cooperates, there will be videos. So you're welcome to pick it up.
Okay. All right, thanks. I'm going to go.
All right, thanks, everyone.
Solstice, everyone.
Bye for now.